the parched territories of the Arizona frontier, some souls are born already condemned. For Isabel Finch, her sentence was etched onto her skin, a crimson birthmark that cascaded across her cheek, a mark the God-fearing folk of Redemption Creek called the Devil's Canvas. She was a ghost in her own life, a girl no one saw, a burden no one wanted. From the sun-scorched mesas, another outcast watched. He was a man of two worlds, and none an Apache they called, Talon his spirit, as solitary as the lone eagle that circled the canyons. He saw the cruelty she endured, but he didn't see the mark. He saw a flicker of defiance in a world determined to extinguish her. This isn't just a story of survival. It's the story of how two forgotten souls, a lonely warrior and the girl no one wanted, forged a legacy from the dust, proving that a life worth living is not given, but seized. The sun was a merciless hammer over the town of Redemption Creek, beating the dust of the main street into a fine, choking powder. For Isabel Finch, the heat was just another layer of the suffocating misery that was her existence. She moved with her gaze fixed firmly on the warped planks of the boardwalk, her worn calico dress clinging to her slender frame. It wasn't the sun she was hiding from, but the eyes. Always the eyes. They flickered towards her from the general store, from the shaded porch of the saloon, from behind the starched lace curtains of the respectable houses. They saw the mark. The Devil's Canvas. Reverend Blackwood had called it from his pulpit one Sunday, his voice ringing with sanctimonious pity. A sprawling deep red birthmark that began at her left temple swept down across her cheekbone and tapered off near the corner of her mouth. It was the color of a blood rose, or a fresh wound, depending on who you asked. To the children who threw pebbles at her, it was a target. To the women who whispered behind their hands, it was a sign of ill omen, a physical manifestation of some sin committed by her long-dead parents. To the men, it was a flaw that rendered her utterly invisible, a piece of damaged goods not worth a second glance. Her life was a rotation of thankless chores in the home of her uncle, a grim-faced blacksmith named Bartholomew Finch. He had taken her in after her parents perished from fever, not out of love, but out of a grudging sense of familial duty that he wore like a horsehair shirt. He never spoke of the mark, but his silence was louder than any insult. He treated her as he treated his anvil, a tool to be used devoid of feeling or spirit. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended her presence in his small, dusty house, as unremarkable as the scuttling of a mouse in the walls. This particular afternoon, the air was thick with more than just heat. A tension coiled through Redemption Creek. Roscoe Pike, the town's barrel-chested deputy, and a man whose cruelty was matched only by his ambition, was holding court outside the saloon. He was everything Isabel feared, loud, arrogant, and possessing a predatory gaze that occasionally lingered on her, not with desire, but with a kind of speculative contempt, as if wondering what purpose such a flawed creature could possibly serve. Another raid up north. Pike boomed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled in the dust. Apaches! Took 3 head of cattle from the Miller homestead. It's that ghost, I tell you, the one they call Talon. A murmur went through the small crowd of loiterers. The name was spoken in whispers around campfires and in hushed tones by frightened travelers. Talon, an Apache who walked alone. He was a phantom, blamed for every shadow that moved and every unexplained disappearance. She moved with a silent strength that defied her fragile appearance, placing the music box on the auction block without a word before retreating to her shadowed corner. The bidding was sluggish. The music box was a luxury few could afford or justify. It was then that Sterling Croft saw his opportunity. He'd long coveted the Whispering Creek Ranch, which bordered his own land and had the best water rights in the valley. He'd tried to strong-arm the old man Hayes into selling, and now he was putting the squeeze on the widow, calling in debts and making her life difficult. Humiliating her publicly would be another turn of the screw. Croft's voice boomed across the hall. $100. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The box was worth 30, maybe 40 on a good day. $100 for the box. Croft continued, a cruel smirk spreading across his face as he turned his gaze from Gwendolen to Kai. For the first time, she saw not just indifference, but a flicker of something she couldn't name. Shame, perhaps. Or was it relief? Pike's looking to settle down. He needs a wife, someone quiet, someone who won't give him any trouble. The wooden spoon fell from Isabel's hand, clattering on the floor. The implication was a physical blow stealing the air from her lungs. Roscoe Pike. The thought was a violation. His meaty hands, his foul breath, the casual cruelty in his eyes. He wants me, she whispered the words, tasting like ash. He's willing to overlook your affliction, Bartholomew said, as if this were a great act of charity. He sees it as a way to keep a wife, humble. There's a $50 settlement in it, enough to get the forge a new bellows and clear my debts. He had sold her. For $50 and a new bellows, the years of servitude, the silent endurance, the hope she secretly harbored, that one day she might simply walk away and disappear. It all collapsed into this single horrifying moment. She was a piece of livestock bartered for equipment. Tears welled hot and bitter, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. A spark of defiance, long dormant and buried under years of humiliation, flickered to life. No, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it filled the small room. Bartholomew slammed his mug down. No, you have no say in it. You are my blood, my burden. I have fed and clothed you for 10 years. You will do as you are told. The wedding is in 2 days. He stood and left the room, the finality of his words echoing off the bare walls. Isabel stood frozen, the world tilting on its axis. 2 days. 2 days until she was handed over to a monster, her life a prison from which there would be no escape. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down, crushing her. She stumbled to the back door and out into the cooling night air, gasping as if she had been underwater. The moon was a cold silver coin in the vast star-dusted sky. The sounds of the town, a distant piano from the saloon, the bark of a dog seemed to come from another world. Her world had just ended. She sank to the ground by the woodpile, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and rage. She would rather die in the desert, devoured by coyotes, than become Roscoe Pike's property. It was then she felt it. A presence. Not a sound, but a shift in the air, the feeling of being watched by something other than the indifferent stars. Her head snapped up her eyes, scanning the deep shadows at the edge of the property, where the town gave way to the scrubland and mesas. A figure detached itself from the darkness. He was tall and lean, moving with a fluid silence that was unnerving. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple cotton shirt, his long black hair unbound. He was Apache, that much was clear, but he carried himself with an unnerving stillness, an aura of profound solitude. His face was all sharp angles and shadows in the moonlight, his expression unreadable. Isabel scrambled backwards, a scream catching in her throat. This had to be him. Talon. The ghost the whole town feared. He had come for cattle for revenge, perhaps for her. He stopped a dozen paces from her, making no threatening move. He simply watched her, his dark eyes seeming to absorb the moonlight itself. He looked not at her face, but at her, It was a disconcerting feeling. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, and the gaze held no judgment, no pity, no contempt. It was just observation. "They talk in the town," he said. His voice was low and quiet, with a rough timbre, as if it was seldom used. It was not the voice of a monster from a campfire story. "They will give you to the man with the silver star, the cruel one." Isabel could only stare, her fear warring with a strange sense of disbelief. He took another slow step forward. "Your uncle trades you for a tool. That man will use you like one." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the small, suffocating house, then back to her. "They give you nothing. I offer you the horizon." The offer was so absurd, so impossible that it broke through her fear. The horizon. What did that even mean? Who are you?" she stammered. "A man with no people," he answered simply. "You are a woman with no people. We are the same." He wasn't. He was a feared warrior. She was a disfigured outcast. But in that moment, under the cold moon, his words struck a chord of truth so deep it resonated in her bones. In the eyes of the world, they were both less than nothing. "Come with me," he said, not as a command, but as a statement of possibility. "Or stay for the cage." He gestured with his chin towards the vast, dark expanse of the desert that stretched out behind him. It was a place of snakes and scorpions, of thirst and starvation. It was a place of death. But her uncle's house, and the future it held with Roscoe Pike, was also a place of death, just a slower, more agonizing kind. Isabel looked at the back door of the house, the cage he spoke of. Then she looked at the silent Apache, and the infinite, terrifying freedom of the wilderness he represented. It wasn't a choice between good and bad, but between two different kinds of death. One was certain, a slow strangulation of the soul. The other was a gamble, a desperate leap into the unknown. The spark of defiance that had flickered earlier now roared into a flame. She would not be sold. She would not be broken. She would rather be a ghost in the desert than a slave in a town that despised her. Slowly, shakily, Isabel Finch, the girl no one wanted, got to her feet. She took a deep breath, the dry night air, feeling like the first breath of a new life. Without a word, she walked past the woodpile, away from the house, and toward the solitary Apache who had offered her the horizon. The world Isabel had known, a world of straight lines, wooden walls, and predictable cruelty, vanished behind her. The wilderness swallowed them whole. Talon moved through the landscape as if he were a part of it, a seamless extension of the rock and shadow. For Isabel, every step was an act of faith and terror. The ground, littered with sharp stones and thorny brush, tore at the thin soles of her shoes. The silence was a living thing, broken only by the rasp of her own breathing, the whisper of the wind through sagebrush, and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. For the first 2 days they barely spoke. Talon's economy of language was absolute. He communicated through gestures, a hand raised to signal a halt, a pointed finger indicating a treacherous patch of ground, a slight nod towards a source of water she never would have seen, a seep hidden beneath a cluster of ferns in the shadow of a rock outcropping. He seemed to read the land like a book, while Isabel felt like an illiterate child, blind to its secrets and its dangers. Her fear was a constant companion. Every rustle in the undergrowth was a rattlesnake, every shadow a mountain lion. She was a creature of walls and fences, and this boundless, untamed space felt like it was actively trying to kill her. Thirst became a torment, or a dry, scratching presence in the back of her throat. Hunger was a dull ache that sharpened into a piercing cramp. The life she had fled seemed almost luxurious in comparison. At least in her uncle's house, there had been a roof, a well, and bread, however stale. On the third day, her resolve crumbled. They had stopped to rest in the meagre shade of a juniper tree, the midday sun beating down relentlessly. Her feet were blistered and bloody, her body ached with a fatigue so profound it felt like a sickness, and her hope had withered to a dry husk. Tears of frustration and despair finally broke free, tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "I can't," she sobbed, the words torn from her. "I can't go on. You should have left me there. This is no different. It's just a bigger cage." Talon, who had been observing the horizon, turned his steady gaze on her. He didn't offer words of comfort. He simply walked over, unslung a small pouch from his hip, and took out a piece of dried meat and a small shriveled root. He placed them in her hand. "Eat," he said. Then he knelt, untied the worn leather of his own moccasins, and held them out to her. "Your shoes are for walking on wood. These are for walking on the earth." Isabel stared at him, then at the moccasins. They were worn, but supple-shaped by miles of silent travel. It was an act of profound practical kindness that cut through her self-pity. She took them, her hands trembling, and slipped her bruised feet into them. The soft deerskin was a balm. As she ate the tough, smoky meat and chewed on the bitter but hydrating root, he finally spoke again, his voice as quiet as the landscape around them. "The cage you left had bars made of whispers and stares," he said, his eyes on the distant, shimmering mountains. "This cage has bars made of thirst and hunger. You can break these bars. The others you could not." His words settled in her heart, simple and true. He was right. Here her struggle was against the elements, not against the hatred of people. It was a pure fight, an honest one. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear, a grudging respect. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a master of this harsh world. That night, as a chill wind swept down from the high country, he built a small, smokeless fire in a hollow, its warmth a welcome comfort. He showed her how to use a flint and steel his large, calloused hands, guiding her smaller ones with surprising patience. As they sat in the small circle of light, the vast darkness pressing in around them, a new kind of silence fell, one that was less empty and more companionable. She found the courage to look at him, truly. Look at him, not as a terrifying Apache phantom, but as the man who had offered her a choice. His face, which had seemed so severe and unreadable now, showed lines of weariness around his eyes. He was not a spirit. He was a man, and a profoundly lonely one at that. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft. "Why did you help me?" He stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "I watched the town. I watched them throw stones at you when you were a girl. I watched them turn their faces away. I saw how they made you small. I know what it is to be cast out." This simple admission of shared experience was more intimate than any touch. It was a bridge built between their two solitudes. The next day their dynamic began to shift. She was no longer just a follower, a burden. She began to learn. She watched how he walked, placing his feet to make the least sound. She learned to identify the plants he gathered: yarrow for wounds, yucca for its edible fruit. He taught her how to find north using the sun and the stars, how to read the tracks of deer and rabbit in the dust. He was a patient, if silent, teacher. Her body hardened. The blisters on her feet turned to calluses. The sun browned her skin, and the constant exertion replaced her fear-induced frailty with a wiry strength. One afternoon, as they were making their way through a narrow, rocky canyon, the sharp, dry rattle of a snake echoed from the rocks just ahead of her. Isabel froze, her blood turning to ice. A large diamondback lay coiled on a sun-warmed ledge, its head raised, its forked tongue tasting the air. Before she could even scream, Talon moved with a speed that was breathtaking. He was a blur of motion, his long knife flashing in the sun. In an instant, the snake's head was severed, its body still writhing in the dust. He kicked the head away and calmly retrieved the body. "Good meat," he said, as if he had just picked a piece of fruit. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "You didn't scream. You are learning to be quiet." Isabel realized he was right. Her instinct had been to freeze, to be silent, not to panic. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. That evening they cooked the snake over the fire, and its meat, white and surprisingly tender, was the most satisfying meal she had ever eaten. She had faced death and was now consuming it for her own survival. A week into their journey, they crested a ridge and looked down into a hidden valley. A small, clear stream wound its way through a grove of cottonwood trees, and the land was greener, more alive than anything she had seen since leaving Redemption Creek. It felt like a sanctuary. As they made their way down into the valley, Isabel felt the sun on her face. She absent-mindedly touched her cheek, her fingers tracing the familiar, hated landscape of her birthmark. Talon noticed the gesture. "The people in the town," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "They called it a devil's mark." Isabel flinched, nodding without looking at him. "They are blind," he said simply. He stopped and pointed to the western sky, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the clouds in brilliant strokes of crimson and rose. It is the color of the sky before the stars come out. It is a sunset mark. Isabel stared at him, stunned. No one had ever described her mark as anything other than a curse, a flaw. To have it reframed, to have it compared to something beautiful and natural, was a gift so profound it left her breathless. Sunset mark. In his eyes, she was not disfigured. She was merely different, a part of the wild, beautiful landscape he called home. In that hidden valley, standing by the whispering water, Isabel Finch felt the last vestiges of the girl from Redemption Creek begin to fall away. She was no longer a pariah. She was a survivor. And for the first time in her life, she was not entirely alone. The alliance born of desperation was slowly, tentatively becoming something more. The hidden valley became their world. Talon called it Willow Creek Basin, a simple descriptive name for a place that felt like paradise to Isabel. The stream provided them with clean water and small silvery fish. The surrounding hills were home to deer and rabbits, and the valley floor was rich with edible plants and roots. For the first time in her memory, Isabel knew the feeling of a full belly and a peaceful mind. Their life settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. Talon taught her the skills she needed, not just to survive, but to thrive. He showed her how to craft snares from sinew and branches, how to skin a rabbit with a sharp piece of flint, and how to tan its hide until it was soft and pliable. He was an exacting teacher, but his praise when it came was a rare and valued thing. A simple "good" after she managed to bring down a grouse with a well-aimed rock was enough to make her heart swell with pride. In return, Isabel brought a different kind of knowledge to their small camp. She had a knack for organization, for turning their rough shelter an overhang of rock. Talon had improved with a wall of woven branches into a semblance of a home. She found flat stones to create a hearth and wove mats from river reeds to sleep on. She discovered a patch of wild berries, and using a trick her mother had taught her long ago, she mashed and dried them into sweet, chewy cakes that would last for weeks. But it was the quiet moments that truly forged their bond. In the evening, sitting by the fire, the silence between them became comfortable, a shared space rather than an empty one. One night, as she was mending a tear in his shirt with a bone needle and a thread of sinew, she found the courage to ask the question that had lingered in her mind. "You said you were a man with no people." She began, her eyes on her work. "Why did you leave them?" Talon was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. He stared into the fire, his face a mask of old memories. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, weighted with a sorrow that felt ancient. "I did not leave," he said. "I was told to go." He told her of his tribe, the Mescalero. He spoke of a war chief named Victorio, a man of great charisma and even greater fury, who led raids against the encroaching white settlers and the army. Talon had been one of his best warriors, respected for his skill in tracking and his courage in battle. Victorio saw only blood. Talon explained, his gaze distant. He believed the answer to our pain was to cause more pain. We raided a homestead. The men were gone, only women and children. Victorio gave the order to leave no one alive. He paused, the crackle of the fire filling the silence. A warrior fights other warriors. He does not raise his hand against a mother holding her child. I refused the order. I stood between my brothers and the cabin door. The conflict was inevitable. Words were exchanged, then blows. He had defied a war chief in front of his warriors, an unforgivable act. For his insubordination, for choosing mercy over vengeance, he was declared an outcast, a walker alone. He was banished, told to never again speak the name of his people or show his face in their lands. To them he was dead. I have been walking alone for 5 winters. He finished, his voice devoid of self-pity. It was simply a fact, a part of his story. Isabel looked at him, seeing him in a new light. The feared phantom of Redemption Creek was a man of principle, a man who had sacrificed everything for a moral conviction. Her respect for him deepened into something akin to awe. He had chosen loneliness over dishonor. "You did the right thing," she whispered, her words fierce with certainty. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his dark eyes. It was clear no one had ever said that to him before. A small, almost imperceptible nod was his only reply, but it was enough. Meanwhile, the whispers of the past were stirring in Redemption Creek. The town had awoken to find Isabel Finch gone. The initial theory was that she had run off a foolish girl, likely already dead in the desert. But Roscoe Pike was not a man to be slighted. The idea that his property, the humble, disfigured girl he had agreed to take, had chosen the wilderness over him, was a stinging insult to his pride. He found tracks near the Finch property, a man's tracks made by moccasins alongside Isabel's smaller shod footprints. He immediately knew who it was. The Apache ghost. "He's taken her!" Pike roared in the saloon, playing the part of the aggrieved protector. "That savage has stolen a white woman. We can't let this stand. It's an affront to every decent man in this town." He conveniently omitted the fact that Isabel's uncle had sold her to him like a sack of grain. Instead, he painted a lurid picture of a helpless Christian girl abducted by a bloodthirsty heathen. He used fear and outrage as his tools, stoking the embers of the town's prejudice into a roaring fire. He offered a bounty, $100 of his own money for Talon's scalp and the safe return of Isabel. He quickly deputized a posse of 5 men. There was young Deputy Miller, barely 20, and eager to prove himself. The 2 Cogan brothers, known more for their drunken brawling than any real skill. A grizzled old prospector named Peterson, who claimed to know the territories, and Bartholomew Finch himself, shamed into joining by Pike's public accusations that he'd failed to protect his own niece. Bartholomew's guilt festered, twisted by Pike, into a burning need for vengeance against the Apache, who had cost him his $50 and his new bellows. Their tracking was clumsy at first. They were town men, unused to the subtle language of the land. But Peterson, for all his bluster, was not without some skill. He found the trail, and though Talon had covered their tracks well, the posse, fueled by whiskey and righteous fury, began their slow, relentless pursuit. They were a serpent slithering out of the corrupt heart of Redemption Creek, its head filled with Roscoe Pike's venomous pride. They had no interest in rescue. Their quest was one of extermination and ego. And they were slowly, surely closing the distance to the tranquil sanctuary of Willow Creek Basin, bringing the hatred of the world Talon and Isabel had escaped from with them. The seasons turned in Willow Creek Basin, each one painting the valley in different hues. The harsh gold of summer softened into the amber and ochre of autumn. Winter arrived with a quiet blanket of snow that muted the landscape and drove them closer to the warmth of their fire. It was followed by the vibrant green of spring, a promise of renewal that seemed to mirror the changes within Isabel herself. The girl who had arrived in the valley, frail and terrified, was gone. In her place was a woman forged in the crucible of the wilderness. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now calloused and capable. She could start a fire with a single spark, track a deer for half a day, and read the clouds for signs of changing weather. The sunset mark on her cheek remained, but it no longer felt like a brand of shame. It was simply a part of her, like the color of her eyes or the strength in her arms. In this world, her value was measured by what she could do, not by how she looked. Talon, too, had changed. The profound solitude that had surrounded him like a shroud was beginning to fray at the edges. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to the sound of her voice, to the way she would sometimes hum a half-forgotten tune while she worked. He found himself speaking more, sharing not just the lore of the land, but small pieces of himself. He told her stories of his boyhood, of learning to hunt, of the legends his grandfather had told him by the fire. He was still a man of few words, but the words he chose now had a warmth they had previously lacked. Their partnership, born of mutual necessity, had deepened into a powerful, unspoken affection. It was in the way he would bring her a wildflower he'd found on a hunt, or the way she would save the best piece of roasted meat for him. It was a language of gestures, of shared glances, of a deep and abiding respect for one another. They were two halves of a whole, perfectly attuned to the rhythms of their life and to each other. The line between survival and living blurred, and in its place, love grew quiet and strong as the ancient cottonwoods by the stream. It happened one night in late spring, with the scent of sage on the air, and the stars blazing with a fierce intensity in the clear desert sky. There was no grand declaration, no flowery prose. He looked at her across the fire, his eyes holding an emotion she had never seen there before, a raw, tender vulnerability. He reached out and gently traced the edge of her birthmark with his thumb, his touch sending a shiver through her. In that touch, there was an acceptance so complete it healed wounds she hadn't even known she carried. She leaned into his hand and he drew her close. Their union under the stars was not a moment of passion, but one of profound connection, a final sealing of the bond between two souls who had found in each other the home they had both been denied. Life continued, but it was now imbued with a new joy, a new purpose. They were no longer just survivors. They were partners in every sense of the word. They worked together to improve their home, reinforcing the walls of their shelter, building a small stone corral for the 2 wild goats Talon had managed to capture, and tame, providing them with a steady supply of milk. A few months later, Isabel knew. A quiet certainty, had settled deep within her. The rhythm of her own body had changed. She was with child. She was terrified, and she was elated. To bring a new life into this wild, dangerous world was a daunting prospect. But the thought of a child, Talon's child, their child, filled her with a fierce, protective love that eclipsed all fear. She waited until evening to tell him. They were sitting by the stream, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the canyon walls. "Talon," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Our family will be larger when the snows come again." He turned to her, his face unreadable for a moment. He looked at her stomach, then into her eyes. The stern mask of the warrior fell away, completely replaced by an expression of such profound wonder and tenderness that it brought tears to her eyes. He placed his large, warm hand gently on her belly, as if he could feel the new life stirring within. "A child," he whispered the word full of awe. "Our child." From that moment on, a new energy infused him. His hunts became more focused, his efforts to secure their home more diligent. He was no longer just providing for the two of them. He was building a future for his family. He taught Isabel which plants were best for a nursing mother, and found a hidden cave high in the cliffs, stocking it with dried meat water and furs. "A safe place," he had said, "if there is ever trouble." Isabel spent her days preparing, weaving a small, soft sleeping basket from river reeds, and sewing tiny clothes from the softest doeskin she could tan. As her body changed, growing round with the new life, she felt a sense of completeness she had never imagined possible. This child, conceived in love in a hidden sanctuary, was the ultimate act of defiance against the world that had cast them both out. It was a testament that even from the most desolate ground, a beautiful life could grow. They were a family now, bound not just by circumstance, but by love and the shared promise of the future. The lonely Apache warrior and the girl no one wanted had forged a new life, a new beginning. But they were blissfully unaware that the serpent from their past was still crawling through the wilderness, its fangs dripping with venom, determined to destroy the paradise they had built. The first sign of trouble was subtle, easily missed by an untrained eye. A single misplaced stone on a game trail that Talon knew was frequented only by deer. A distant flock of crows taking flight in panicked unison when there was no storm on the horizon. To Talon, these were not random occurrences. They were words in a language of imminent danger. A quiet, cold watchfulness settled over him. For days, he spent more time on the high ridges overlooking the valley, his silhouette a motionless sentinel against the sky. "Someone is coming," he said to Isabel one evening, his voice grim. "They hunt us." The peace that had settled over Isabel's heart for the past year was shattered, replaced by a cold dread. "Pike," she breathed the name, tasting like poison. "Yes," Talon confirmed. "A man like that does not forget an insult to his pride." Panic, raw and primal, threatened to overwhelm her. She was heavy with child, slower, more vulnerable than ever before. But then, she looked at Talon's calm, determined face, and felt the strength he had taught her rise up to meet her fear. She was not the helpless girl from Redemption Creek anymore. This was her home, this was her family, and she would fight for it. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. "We do not run," Talon said, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "This is our land. We make them bleed for every step they take on it." His plan was not one of direct confrontation. It was a strategy of 1,000 cuts, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain as his greatest weapon. For 2 days he worked tirelessly, turning their sanctuary into a carefully constructed trap. He set deadfalls along the narrowest parts of the canyon entrance, rigged a rock slide on a steep cliff face, and placed sharpened stakes in concealed pits along the path he knew they would have to take. He was no longer the gentle partner. He was the ghost the settlers whispered about, a deadly predator on his own hunting ground. Isabel, despite her condition, worked alongside him. She gathered armfuls of thorny cholla cactus and placed them in thick patches to block alternative routes. She sharpened dozens of arrows, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She was the keeper of the home, and her protective instincts were a raging fire. The morning of the third day, Talon returned from the ridge. "They are here," he said simply. "6 of them." The posse entered the mouth of the valley with a swaggering confidence. Roscoe Pike was in the lead, his face flushed with anticipation. He saw the greenness, the stream, the signs of a good camp, and a greedy smile spread across his face. He got comfortable. Pike sneered to his men, got lazy with his stolen prize. "Let's go smoke him out." The first to fall was one of the Kogan brothers. Distracted by what he thought was a clear path, he stumbled into a pit Talon had concealed with a flimsy layer of branches and dirt. His scream was cut short as he was impaled on the fire-hardened stakes below. The sudden brutal death sent a shockwave of fear through the posse. Their confident advance slowed to a nervous crawl. Next, Talon used the terrain itself. As they navigated a narrow ledge, a single arrow from Talon's bow, fired from an unseen position high above, struck the rock face near a carefully balanced pile of scree. The vibration was enough. A torrent of rocks and gravel cascaded down, sweeping the second Kogan brother off the ledge and into the canyon below. Panic began to set in. This wasn't a hunt. It was an execution. They were being picked apart by an enemy they couldn't even see. The grizzled prospector Peterson lost his nerve. "This is his ground, Pike," he yelled. "He's a devil. We should turn back." "Coward." Pike roared, his face purple with rage. "There's only one of him. Keep moving." He shoved Deputy Miller forward. "You and Finch check that thicket. Flush him out." Bartholomew Finch, his face pale with terror, and the young deputy moved cautiously towards a dense patch of mesquite. As they pushed through the branches, an arrow hissed out of the shadows, burying itself in Bartholomew's shoulder. He cried out and fell, clutching the wound. Miller, seeing the flash of movement, fired his pistol wildly into the trees. From his perch, Talon watched his expression grim. He had aimed to wound, not to kill the blacksmith. His fight was with Pike. Now only 4 men remained. Pike, the wounded Bartholomew, a terrified Miller, and the prospector. Pike, blinded by fury, finally spotted Talon, moving between the rocks, and charged forward, firing his revolver. Bullets ricocheted off the canyon walls as Talon melted back into the shadows. Pike's reckless charge led him directly into Talon's final trap. He followed Talon into a narrow ravine, the one place Talon had told Isabel to stay away from. This was where Isabel's part in the defense began. Hidden on the cliff above, she had her own pile of rocks. At Talon's sharp, hawk-like cry, she heaved a large boulder over the edge. It didn't hit Pike, but it landed behind him, blocking his only escape route. He was trapped. Talon stepped out from behind a rock, his knife in his hand. Pike stood, panting, his revolver empty. The 2 men faced each other, the hunter and the hunted, the brute and the warrior. "Savage!" Pike snarled, drawing a large Bowie knife. "I'll take that scalp myself and drag that marked-up witch back where she belongs." The insult to Isabel ignited a cold fire in Talon's eyes. He didn't speak. He moved. The fight was brutal and short. Pike was strong, a brawler used to overpowering men in saloon fights. But Talon was a dancer of death, his movements economical and precise. He dodged Pike's clumsy lunges, his own knife a blur, a feint, a sidestep, and a final swift thrust. Roscoe Pike sank to his knees, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, before collapsing into the dust. The silence that followed was absolute. From the rocks, Deputy Miller and Peterson stared horrified. They had seen their leader, the embodiment of the town's authority, cut down with terrifying ease. Bartholomew Finch was groaning on the ground, his fight long since gone. Talon emerged from the ravine, his face like carved stone. He looked at the remaining men, his gaze lingering on the young deputy. He raised his bow, an arrow nocked. Peterson threw down his rifle, his hands in the air. Miller, shaking, did the same. Talon walked toward them. He stopped in front of Bartholomew, who flinched away from him. Talon simply looked at the arrow in the man's shoulder, then at his face, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. He turned to Miller. "Take him," Talon said, his voice a low growl. "Take them both. Leave this valley and never return. Tell the town that the girl they cast out is gone. This is her land now, and it is guarded." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and melted back into the rocks, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. Isabel rushed to him, her heart pounding. She checked him for wounds, her hands trembling. He was untouched. They held each other, the adrenaline of the battle giving way to the profound relief of survival. They had faced the serpent, and they had won. Their garden, their home, was safe once more. The silence that descended upon Willow Creek Basin after the battle was heavier than any that had come before. The scent of gunpowder and blood lingered in the air, a foul stain on their sanctuary. Deputy Miller and Peterson, moving with the terrified haste of spooked animals, had fashioned a crude litter for Bartholomew Finch and fled the valley, their panicked retreat a final chaotic scar on the landscape. Talon and Isabel were left with the aftermath. The bodies of the Cogan brothers and Roscoe Pike lay where they had fallen, grim monuments to the violence that had invaded their home. There was no triumph in their victory, only a deep, sorrowful exhaustion. Talon, with Isabel's help, disposed of the bodies, burying them in shallow, unmarked graves far down the canyon, a necessary but grim task that took the rest of the day. That night they sat by their fire, but the comforting warmth did little to chase away the chill that had settled deep in their bones. The peace of their valley had been shattered, its innocence lost forever. "They will come back," Isabel said, her voice a low whisper. "Miller will tell them what happened. They'll send more men. The army, maybe." Talon stared into the flames, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond the physical exertions of the day. "The young one, Miller. I saw his eyes. He was afraid, but he was not full of hate like Pike. He saw the truth." Talon paused, shaking his head slowly. "But the truth may not be enough. The town needs a monster. They will twist his story to fit the one they want to believe." He was right. Their freedom had been won at a steep price, the price of anonymity. They were no longer a myth. They were a known location, a target. The serpent had been slain, but it had laid eggs of vengeance that would surely hatch. "The cave," Isabel said, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "The safe place you prepared." Talon nodded grimly. "We cannot stay here. Not now. We will rest for a few days, gather what we can, and then we must leave. We must go deeper into the mountains to a place where no one will ever think to look." The decision was a painful one. This valley was the birthplace of their love, the forge of their new life, the only true home either of them had ever known. To leave it felt like a kind of death, an admission that the world's hatred was a force that could not be entirely defeated, only outrun. As they prepared for their departure, a new dynamic emerged between them. Talon had been wounded during his final fight with Pike, a deep gash on his forearm that he had ignored in the heat of the moment. Now it was inflamed and painful. Isabel, who had once been the student, became the caregiver. She cleaned the wound with a poultice of yarrow and willow bark, her touch gentle but firm. She took over the preparations for their journey, her movements efficient and purposeful. She was no longer his dependent. She was his equal, his partner, in a way that had been fully cemented by the crucible of battle. Seeing her strength, her resilience, filled Talon with a fierce pride. Meanwhile, a dazed and bleeding trio stumbled back into Redemption Creek. Deputy Miller's story was a confused, terrified jumble. He spoke of an ambush of a valley that was a death trap of an Apache who moved like a phantom, but he also spoke of things the town didn't want to hear. He spoke of how Pike had charged forward recklessly, how they had been the invaders, and most disturbingly, he spoke of Isabel. She wasn't a prisoner, Miller stammered to the small, shocked crowd that gathered in the saloon. She fought with him. She was defending her home. His words were met with disbelief and scorn. The narrative was already set, a helpless white woman, brainwashed or terrified into submission by a savage. The idea that she had chosen that life, that she had fought to protect it, was unthinkable. It challenged the very foundation of their worldview. The old Prospector Peterson offered a simpler, more palatable version. "He's a ghost, a demon!" He rasped his eyes wide with fear. "He killed 'em all without us barely laying an eye on him. The girl's bewitched. The whole valley is cursed." This was the story that took root, the story of a demon in the hills and his bewitched bride. Redemption Creek didn't send out another posse. Fear had replaced their righteous anger. They sealed off the memory of Willow Creek Basin, branding it as a place of death and evil, a part of the map to be avoided at all costs. Deputy Miller, ostracized for his confusing and uncomfortable version of the truth, quietly packed his bags and left town a month later, unable to live with the ghosts of what he had seen. Talon's prediction had been correct. The town had twisted the story to fit its own prejudices, but in doing so, they had inadvertently given Talon and Isabel what they most needed to be left alone. The fear they had inspired had become their shield. Unaware of this, Talon and Isabel made their final preparations. They packed dried meat skins, tools, and the small baby basket Isabel had woven. They took one last look at the shelter that had been their home, at the stream that had given them water, at the valley that had given them a life. "He gave me the horizon," Isabel whispered, thinking back to that first night. "I did not know it would keep moving." Talon took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "The horizon is not a place," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "It is a promise, the promise of a new sun. We will find another valley. We will build another home. As long as we are together, we carry our home with us." With that, they turned their backs on Willow Creek Basin. They walked away from the graves and the ghosts climbing higher into the remote, unforgiving peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, their future uncertain, their freedom fragile, but their bond unbreakable. They were heading not toward a place on a map, but toward the promise of a life lived on their own terms, forever beyond the reach of the world that had tried to destroy them. 7 years passed. The world below continued its march of progress, but high in the Dragoon Mountains, Talon and Isabel found a true sanctuary. In a hidden meadow, accessible only by a secret trail, they built a cabin of pine and stone, and a life the world could not touch. Here they raised their 2 children, Samuel and Rose, who grew up inheriting 2 worlds. They learned to read tracts from their father and letters from their mother, becoming the first of a new line born of a love that defied prejudice. Isabel was transformed. The timid girl from Redemption Creek was gone, replaced by a strong, confident woman. The sunset mark on her cheek was no longer a brand of shame, but simply a feature of the matriarch who was the heart of their family. Talon, too, had found a peace he never knew. The silence of the walker alone was finally filled by the warmth of his wife and the laughter of his children. One evening, as the sun set over their high mountain home, Isabel watched Talon patiently teaching Samuel to carve while she braided wildflowers into Rose's hair. This was the culmination of their impossible journey. The girl no one wanted was now cherished the center of her own universe. The lonely warrior had found his people. Talon had offered her the horizon, and they had discovered it was not some distant place on a map, but the profound, quiet peace of a family whole and free under the vast western sky. The story of Talon and Isabel is a powerful reminder that our worth is never defined by the judgment of others. It's a testament to the fact that love can blossom in the most desolate of landscapes, and that a family is built not by blood or by society's rules, but by unbreakable bonds of loyalty and respect. They were two outcasts who found in each other the courage to defy a world that had rejected them, forging a legacy of freedom and love high in the remote wilderness. Their story is etched into the very soul of the Old West, a quiet epic of survival defiance and the creation of a home. If their incredible journey from outcasts to pioneers moved, you please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who appreciates tales of resilience and the untamed human spirit. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the forgotten legends of the American frontier. Thank you for listening.